I had to learn how to be ethno-conscious, but not ethnocentric. And ethno-conscious, I'm conscious and aware of my blackness, but my blackness is not the center of my life. So my life, the way I function, the way I think, my values, I'm not Afrocentric. I'm Christocentric. And you can't have two different centers if you're going to be someone that is a follower of Jesus.
Welcome to the Shepherd's Podcast, a podcast by pastors for pastors, designed to be a communal space where relationships and resources bring refreshing and renewal to those who shepherd and lead congregations. Connect with us and check out more episodes and resources at theshepherdsnetwork.com.
Welcome to the Shepherd's Podcast. I'm John Carter, your host, and today we're going to have a conversation about how do we as shepherds address the issues that our people are dealing with day in and day out that have to do with the culture that we're living in. You know, we're in a time right now, we're entering into a season where people are making a choice about things that they're going to be voting for in the fall. And just as it was in our last cycle where there was a lot of division, and a lot of that showed up in our churches, a lot of our people today are wondering, how do we think? How do we address issues when we have in our congregations people that come from different backgrounds, different ideas, different ideologies, different economic backgrounds, different cultures, and different races? How do we address it in a way that's not going to injure the church, but is going to build it? And so we want to talk about that, and we're going to lean into it today. Now, I have as a guest a dear friend, a pastor who has raised up an amazing church in New Jersey, Christ Church. And he is a wise man, not only in his experience as a pastor, but also in his academic experience. So I want to welcome David Ireland. David.
So good to be here. Thank you so much, John. Thanks for the opportunity.
Dr. David Ireland, I should say, right?
Okay.
It's so good to have you here today.
Oh, my pleasure.
David, talk a little bit about your experience and your journey as a shepherd, as a minister. When did you start feeling the call of God on your life, that you knew you were called to be the minister?
Well, I came to faith in Christ when I was 20 years old. In fact, it was July 6, 1982 at 10 p.m. It was so drastic, the conversion, because I was an atheist. And I just finished my first degree in engineering, in mechanical engineering. And then I didn't even know I was praying. I didn't believe in the existence of God. And I said, God, if you're real, change me.
Why did you pray that prayer?
I didn't even know I was praying. I was just so frustrated because I came to my wit's end. I said, there must be more to life than making money, having a pretty wife, having a nice house, a great career, even though I had none of those things. Just finished up my degree a couple of weeks prior.
Your master's?
No, that was my undergraduate degree. And then when I came to faith in Christ, I went right to graduate school. I did my first master's in environmental engineering. And so that was how I worked, before I became a pastor. And then went to seminary and did my master's in theology and kept on going.
When did you pioneer Christ Church?
We started in 1986. With 6 people, and my wife and I made 8. And so,
wow.
So it was a long time ago.
Very parallel. Yeah. We started in 1990 with about 8 people.
Okay.
8 adults and some kids.
Yeah.
So, and you started in New Jersey.
I started in New Jersey, and it was about 2 weeks after our inception. I was 24 years old at the time, and my wife was expecting our first child, and we've been married at that point about 3 years. And she asked me to go to the grocery store for her and pick up a couple of items, and so I went. Picked up one of those little red hand baskets. I'm walking down the aisle, putting things in the basket that my wife wanted. And I got to one aisle, and I just happened to look down the other end of the aisle, and I saw different kinds of people. I saw whites, I saw blacks, I saw Latinos, I saw Asians, I saw biracial people. And for the first time in my life, John, I heard the audible voice of God. And God said to me, David, why can't it be like that in my house? And I started weeping uncontrollably because I felt the burden of God just rest on my shoulder. And at that point, I didn't have an idea, what is Christ Church called to be? What's my vision? I'm a young 24-year-old.
Just preaching on Sunday.
Yeah, exactly.
To a few folks.
And then I couldn't hold back the tears. I started weeping uncontrollably in the supermarket. Now, you have to understand, if you ever watched the show Star Trek, that sci-fi show, I'm the Vulcan. I'm just the guy with the facts. I'm the facts.
Logical. Mr. Logic.
Exactly. By the time I got to the cashier, I'm checking out, I'm still crying. She may have thought that I was trying to, this is a new ploy to get some free food, but it wasn't that. I was messed up. When I got back to the apartment, I told Marlinda, my wife, I said, honey, here's what happened. And so we wept together. And that was the day it was birthed inside of me. I want to build a multiracial, multi-ethnic, cross-cultural church. And so I've been chasing after that for all these years, and I'm still at it. I've studied it. In fact, my emphasis in seminary was on urban ministry. That's what it was back then. And then when I did my PhD in organizational leadership, my dissertation was on the black-white relationship in large multiracial churches in America.
Wow.
So I actually went across the country studying racially diverse churches. Then I did another degree afterwards at Cambridge, and my dissertation there was on how do you establish interracial training, or it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. The technical language is intercultural competence that white leaders enjoy. So I'm an expert in helping the white guy understand how to get along with people that's different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of times folks don't realize that they need some help in that regard.
Yeah, because I think that from the typical white leader's perspective, when they hear anything about diversity, they feel that they're going to be demonized, beat up.
They feel it's a very political thing. It's got some kind of a political agenda to it. And sometimes it does.
Correct. And they feel as if, hey, I'm going to be the brunt of whatever the issue is. I'm at fault. And so we have to learn how to dismantle that.
We'll talk about what your church is today. So Christ Church has grown from 8 people to, how many people are you serving?
Well, about 10,000 people.
10,000 people.
About 75 different nationalities.
My goodness.
So it's very diverse.
How many campuses?
We have 3 in-person physical campuses, and 1 online campus. Getting ready to launch another 2 physical campuses in the next 12 months.
Now, you said 70 different nations.
Yeah.
So do you have a majority population? Is it
in terms of nation? Well, it's going to be America, but you'll have...
In terms of, let's say, race.
Oh, race. Okay. I'll deal with the campus where I am, which is in Rockaway, New Jersey. That campus is probably about 65% non-black and 35% black. Black includes, Africans, Caribbeans, African Americans, right. And then you have whites, and you have Asians, you have Hispanic, you have, and then you have Native Americans as well.
Our church, we have a number of African immigrants. Do you have?
We do.
Immigrants?
Yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, so when I say it's 75 nationalities, I'm saying these are people that were born in those countries, and we just had.
I see. Okay.
So they're not just.
They're first generation.
They're first generation. And that happened one day when I was teaching a message called, cross-cultural worship. And about 5 minutes into my sermon, I wanted to get the audience's attention in a deep way. And I stopped, and I stopped the sermon, I stopped preaching. I said, if you were born in another country, stand to your feet. And all these people stood to their feet. And I said, I'm going to ask you, from people all the way in the back of the room to the front, yell out the name of your country. And if you who are standing, you were born in the same country, sit down, your country's already represented. And that's what we saw, 75 different nations.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's there.
And Pastor David, as you have built this church, you must have gone through iterations of challenges, facing.
Absolutely.
So I talk to a lot of pastors who want to have a more multicultural approach, want to reach people internationally across racial and economic barriers. What are some of the keys you've learned to doing that? I mean, you had a vision for it, and I think that's where it starts, right? You have it in your heart.
Yeah, I had the burning bush experience, so to speak, and so something was birthed inside of me. That's one thing. But second, there's certain things I had to adopt. Well, one of which is I had to learn how to be ethno-conscious, but not ethnocentric. And ethno-conscious, I'm conscious and aware of my blackness, but my blackness is not the center of my life. So my life, the way I function, the way I think, my values, I'm not Afrocentric. I'm Christocentric. And you can't have 2 different centers if you're going to be someone that is a follower of Jesus. Either he's at the center of your life or he's not. Ethnocentrism is when your ethnicity is the centerpiece of your life. It's the books that you read, the food that you eat, the way you may speak, the language, the emphasis, the businesses that you support, the way you identify yourself, the way you walk through the world, so to speak. And so if you look at I'll give one biblical text as an example. It's in John chapter 4 when Jesus is by the well, and here comes this Samaritan woman, and then Jesus says to her, can you give me something to drink? And she says, you are a Jew and I'm a Samaritan, and yet you're asking me for something to drink? So she's walking through the world saying that the way my social markers, I'm a woman,
I'm a Samaritan,
you're a Jew. And so my awareness of how I comport myself and how I see myself and how I believe you see me And this is how I identify myself, and that's how I interact. That's the awareness of that's my lived experience. And so she was then, if I use the language, Samaritan-centric, in other words. She's also centered on her gender. And as a consequence of that, it affects her judgment, affects how she can receive things and how she interacts with Jesus. And Jesus did not even feed into that aspect. He didn't start the conversation at her starting point.
In other words, he didn't like go after her.
No.
Her filters.
Exactly. Not that he was ignoring it. He understood, I have another agenda, and it's not going to be going through these social markers that you use to identify yourself. I'm looking for your soul and transformation. I'm not going to be hindered by your gender or by your race. Those things won't be able to be hindrances to me. So I think then, coming back to the question about, that was one of the challenges. I had to be able to say even to some ministerial groups who said, can you come and be a part of it? I said, well, so am I. I said, certainly I can be a part of it. And the ones that may have asked me may have been African-American. I said, I certainly can be a part of it. But I also have pastors on my team that are white and that are Hispanic. I said, can they be a part of it? Because if they can't be a part of it, I can't be a part of it. Right. And so when I put that, I had to draw a line in the sand, so to speak. And in some instances...
How was that received by...
Many individuals, that was another turning point. So I was, in other words, ostracized by different groups. I was not black enough. I was not white enough. I was not Asian enough. I'm not Hispanic enough. So I was as if it were, I'm my own quote unquote tribe, because a lot of individuals don't know how to speak or do ministry in a pluralistic way or in a multicultural way. So I had to draw a line in the sand.
Now, a lot of pastors are, I would say most churches are relatively homogenous.
Yes.
Racially, economically, right?
Yeah.
Politically. To have a diverse church ethnically, you have to have diversity in other areas as well. Correct?
Sure. Well,
and so how do you navigate those conversations between people that come from very different worldviews?
I think that it starts my teaching style. If I'm on a Sunday morning, or let me back up and lay a technical framework.
Okay.
Yeah, I did my dissertation on the black-white relationship in large multiracial churches in America. The technical definition of a multiracial church is where at least 20% of the congregation is of a different racial makeup than the majority. So I would look at churches, if the church was...
That's important.
Yeah, that's very important.
There's churches that might have like a 10%.
That's not considered
that's
multiracial.
Really not multiracial, right?
No. And
what is it about 20%?
20% shows that there's a large contingency of individuals that are different than the majority, and they feel that this is their church, and they have the rights, so to speak. They've bought into it, and they're there. They take ownership. They've built relationships. They're experiencing community. They're experiencing a sense of belonging. And so that 20%, it makes it very clear. So you can look out and see the social markers. When I use that language of social markers, the identifying features that makes it clear that I'm different than others. So it's there. And so I think that's important when we realize that. And I'm bringing that point out because there were like 6 different definitions of what the of a racially diverse church. And some people espouse something that was ridiculous. Ridiculous meaning the body of Christ globally is racially diverse. Therefore, my church locally is racially diverse. Now, and some people espouse that definition, which is very far-reaching in the sense of, or far-fetched. This is a better word. It's not. It doesn't make sense. So once you understand that that's a goal, going back again, there's a principle called the social exchange theory. Because I had to say, okay, what is causing churches to be racially diverse? So I had to build it around a theory that assesses and evaluates people that cross over their racial and cultural divide to come into my world and be able to not only experience my world, but say that they enjoy my world and find value in my world. So that's what that theory does. So in other words, I'm going to use this perspective since I'm African-American. Why would a white guy drive by 100 churches that are homogeneously white to come to Christ Church where I'm not white and say that Christ Church is my church? And so there must be something going on at Christ Church that makes that person feel a sense of belonging. And there are 4 reasons, John. Because I did focus groups to evaluate if the church had a senior pastor who was white. I would establish 2 focus groups Focus group is a technical term, 8 to 12 people that you meet with for 60 to 90 minutes to be able to extract information that you can't get from the books. So I would have 2 focus groups of each church. Of the senior pastor was white, I established 2 focus groups of people that were black to try to understand, why are you here?
Okay.
If the senior pastor was black, I had 2 focus groups with individuals that were white to try to find out, why are you here? What keeps you here?
Sure.
It was stark. Each of those groups that I met with, it fell in one of 4 places as to why the church became cross-racial. The first was the sovereignty of God. Like in 1906 at Azusa Street in California, it was a multiracial move. Why were people
The
coming?
outpouring of the Holy Spirit.
The outpouring of the Holy Spirit. I can't control that. That's above my pay grade. So I have nothing.
God sovereignly did that.
Correct. The other 3 things, the other 3 reasons I can be able to have some involvement. The second reason is that the worship experience. Something is happening in the worship experience that's so transformative that I'll drive by 100 churches where everybody looks like me to go there, because when I go there in worship, I experience God's presence and I feel transformed in that presence. And the stark reality was that in some of these churches, that was the reason.
The worship
experience, period.
Wow.
The third reason is the sense of belonging. When I went through the focus groups and then assessed, evaluated, get the words, transcribe the conversations, and then go through a quantitative analysis to see what are these words, why are these words being repeated, and why that? And you found out that the reason why that particular church was cross-racial was the fact that it was the sense of belonging. You just felt like, man, this is where I belong. I feel at home. The fourth reason was the pastor, not the preaching, the person. Something flowed out of that pastor's life that was so transformative. I'll drive by 100 churches where everybody looks like me to go there. Because
you said not the preaching, and yet most people are going to become exposed to the pastor through his preaching ministry.
But it's something else happening.
It's not the content.
It's not the content.
Okay.
And it's not even the style. It's the fact that something is coming out of, in terms of the heart, is a transformative effect that's happening in the dynamics. It's almost like when you're around some people, you can just feel a warmth, even though if they're telling you something that's very tough.
Yeah.
But you just feel as if, man, that guy loves me, even though he's confronting me.
What do you think it is? What do you think it is in pastors that attract multicultural congregations? What are some words you would give to that unseen characteristic?
They make you feel welcomed. They make you feel valued. They know you're there, and they're aware of you, and they've earned the right to speak to you. I remember one church in Oakland, California, that I went through the evaluative technical research. This particular pastor was white, had over 50 different nationalities represented in his church. He said that he was able to, and he was an older gentleman, he said that during the civil rights movement with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he said, I marched with Dr. King. And he then said, I've been able to go into a racially divisive environment where if an African American was shot by police or something that was happening that was racially charged, I was the only white guy that could be able to walk in there and they would listen to me when I speak. He said, I've earned the right. Now, I remember studying and looking at another church that was in Pennsylvania, also racially diverse, white pastor. But he did not have the ability to speak to any racially motivated situations in his own congregation.
Why?
Because his silence during difficulty made him lose his voice.
Here's the question. Why was he silent?
Because
I ask pastors that approach me and say, how do you build a multicultural church?
Yeah.
And because our church is 50% Caucasian and 50% nations of the world, right?
Right.
So, and I try to say it began in my life, similar as it did to you. In 1995, we were 5 years old. I was teaching through the book of James, and verse by verse. And as I got into some of these sections that talked about, pure religion and undefiled is to look out for widows and orphans and to keep oneself on spot, I just began to realize that I had, if I was going to minister to all people, I need to understand all people.
Sure.
Even though it was in my heart to have a multicultural church. And so I had to go on a journey of really sitting and talking to people that weren't Caucasian, that tell me your story, tell me your experience, tell me where you've been hurt, and really listen to that. And it opened my eyes to a reality that I really wasn't tuned into. So that was my journey. And then God just puts it in your heart to learn. But if you're a pastor and you want to develop that characteristic, that people, regardless of their racial background, feel comfortable. I mean, obviously, silence is a problem, but what is the characteristic in your person's, what are some of those spiritual qualities you need to nurture?
And what you've been sharing there, I call that desired awareness.
Okay.
That means that there is an awareness that you wanted to experience that you knew you lacked. So you became a student.
Yes.
And you ask questions. That's what a student is, a learner. And you're posing questions. And so and a lot of people, they lack the humility to ask questions. And so when you go, and some people, and they're awkward. And so sometimes I say to people, I said, look, if you want to learn, whether it may be someone is a refugee or someone is of a different racial makeup, say to them that I'm trying to develop my cross-cultural skills. Do you mind if I ask you some questions? And please stop me and correct me if I say something that's wrong or offensive, because I'm just trying to learn. I'm a learner. I'm a student. The moment you say that, everybody wants to be a teacher. And so when you put yourself in a position of being a student, the other person assumes the posture of a teacher, and all of a sudden, school's in. And so I think that the idea, is recognizing that.
I think a lot of pastors have a desire to have multicultural ministry, but they feel like they're going to get that by preaching about issues.
No.
And it's really a heart thing.
It's not. It's not. And I think that we hide behind sometimes the idea that, I don't live in an area that's diverse. No, that's not true. Because people drive by 100 churches. They'll, just like you'll go to a restaurant that's 40 minutes away from where you live because you like the food. It's not that. That principle I brought out about the social exchange theory is very real, in that if I go to a certain church and when I go there, I feel fed, I feel welcomed, I feel a sense of belonging, I encounter God. Guess where I'm going again next week? I'm going back.
Right.
Period.
And so a pastor could help create that environment by certainly looking at how they make people belong.
Yes.
Right. Work on practical ways to welcome people.
Right.
Worship. How do you create a worship environment that's going to be appealing to people that are outside of your majority culture?
I think one of the things I do is that, and I always encourage people to do the same, is that I try not to be the person that's, quote unquote, challenging people. I let the scripture challenge them. So now all of a sudden I take myself outside of the equation, so they won't say David Ireland did this, David Ireland wants that, he's demanding this of me. No. I start putting them in the text by saying, like, for example, I referenced John chapter 4, a moment ago with Jesus at the well, and the Samaritan woman comes. When I teach that text, I'll say, come and sit next to me. I'm sitting on this rock, and I'm watching Jesus, the master cross-cultural teacher, interact with this woman to teach us cross-cultural lessons. Come sit next to me and let's watch him. So I put them in the text. Now, and then, so when I'm now talking about the woman and how she sees herself and how Jesus interacts with her, I'm not saying I'm challenging you to be that. I'm just saying, look at what our Lord did.
Just observe it.
Yeah. And then I'll say, don't you think we can do that too? Yeah.
And it brings people in.
It draws them in because they're not defensive. So I disarm them. The story.
Right.
Yeah. And I've used that same model, when it comes to even Galatians 2 with Peter at Antioch, and he's no longer fellowshipping with the Gentile believers. And I stumbled on that because as I'm studying the whole idea of what it means to help people be disarmed so they can be cross-cultural, I learned, and particularly my dissertation that I mentioned about helping white leaders enjoy diversity training, and more technically intercultural competence, having competence in intercultural relationship.
Like that term.
Yeah,
I like that term.
And so when I learned that a white leader is disarmed when you share topics on intercultural competence through stories.
Interesting.
And that's not just white leaders. There's anybody that has experienced what's called diversity fatigue. I'm tired of
diversity.
Yeah, it's actually a technical term. I'm tired of you talking about diversity. And then in the world of diversity management, how do I manage?
Real quick.
Okay.
Diversity fatigue. I've never heard that before.
Okay.
Would you suggest that is a condition that happens to Caucasians, or does it happen?
Everybody.
It happens to Black people too.
Everybody. Because
people,
everyone,
when they have to constantly have a conversation around their ethnicity.
right.
Yeah.
And sometimes at the workplace where there's training on how to be able to have cross-cultural conversations or diversity, equity, and inclusion training, DEI classes. And there's a diversity fatigue. Diversity, I'm tired of talking about diversity. I'm tired of hearing about diversity. I'm tired of all of that. The media comes at you. And so to avoid all that, getting back to the Antioch, experience with Peter, what I did since I unearthed that piece that people learn through stories, when I'm teaching on that, I'll say, come with me to Antioch. And I put a table on the altar. It's set up like a dining room table, like we're getting ready to have a Thanksgiving meal. I'll have it set with plates and cups and the silverware. And I'll sit at the table. I'll say, let's eavesdrop in on the Gentiles when they're having a conversation, having experienced then this dismissive relationship that they had with Peter. And then I just, I paint the picture theologically, I set it up, then be true to the text. And then I say, come, let's listen to their conversation. And then I'll say, did you hear that one Gentile say to the other? He said, I don't know if I can invite my friends any longer to our church. I don't know if I can invite family members because here I'm coming to the very house of God and I'm being victimized because of my culture. It's there.
What I am, right?
Yeah. And then he says, I don't know if I can be, and he says, what have I done? Why is Peter no longer talking to me? What have I done? Have I dishonored him in any way? So I'm not confronting you, the listener in the congregation. I'm putting them in the text.
The individual.
Putting them in the text and letting them see it. So now I'm dealing with desired awareness. I want you to see how that Gentile leader or Gentile felt when their own leader. And then I'll take the conversation even a little bit deeper. I say, one Gentile says, think about my own pastor, Barnabas. He no longer eats with me. What have I done to my pastor? Well, what do I do now? And so I'm not providing any answers yet. I'm just raising awareness. I'm raising awareness as to how the person feels. I'm raising awareness of the tension of the text. I'm raising awareness as to the issues that need to be resolved. I'm raising awareness. Then I'll say, maybe we should talk to Paul about this. Right. And then I'll say the text, and I'll read the text. Oh, Paul's already aware. He's already aware. And then I bring in some technical stuff. I said, look at how Paul addresses this by using an ethic of care. Because Paul recognizes that, he cares about the Gentiles, because an ethic of care has these components. You care about, you care for, there's care giving, and care receiving. Those four things must be there, and when you add those four things together, equals care. So when you care about, a lot of people care about things, but it's on the surface. I care about the homeless. But when I care for, it requires competency, it requires training, requires some education, some type of way where I'm going to be really schooled about this so I'm be able to be effective. Then there's the caregiving. How am I helping someone that's homeless? And so to that text again, I used the example. I said, suppose I said I'm the principal caregiver for my elderly mom. I cook all of her meals. People say, man, David, that's so honorable. I said, well, part of care and the ethic of care is care receiving. It's where you ask the person who's been receiving care, do they feel cared for?
Yeah, you kind of find it, is it working?
Yeah. And I said, ask my mother. And she may say, yeah, David does cook my meals for me. And then she may say, but you know what he does? He puts the plate on the floor. She said, that's how I'm fed. I don't feel cared for. And then so when I'm preaching there in front of the congregation, I take the plate off the table and put it on the floor. So again, I'm dealing with the heart.
Right. The heart.
I'm dealing with the heart.
Putting people in their shoes.
There you go.
Because once you see it, you don't unsee it, right?
Yeah.
You get it.
Right.
You know what it's like. I think getting people past the reactive mind,
right,
where they're just seeing, they're being conditioned to think, well, if you're talking to me about diversity, then you have a political agenda,
right,
you're compromised. There's some people who feel this way. I'm not racist. Why would I, and yet saying, getting to that person to see, yes, but you may not have your eyes open to everything that other people experience. And let's talk about how you can grow in that area.
Exactly. And using that Galatians 2 example again, I'm saying, look at how Paul was coaching Peter.
Mm-hmm.
And you're challenging
that's
people.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I said this. So Paul was functioning as a diversity coach there for Peter. And I challenged people. I said, look, just because we need to be coached doesn't mean that we're not good. And I'll use the world of football, for example. The average football team, they have 15 coaches. And these guys are the best of the best in the world, these professional football players, regardless of what your team, who your favorite team is. But yet they have 15 different coaches to help them.
You're a Jets guy, right?
Actually, Giants.
The Giants.
Yeah.
Well, didn't you do some ministry?
I did some ministry with the Jets and with the Giants. Okay. And so that's where I learned about the 15 coaches.
Okay.
But I'm looking at these professional athletes, from strength and fitness coaches to defensive, offensive, all these coaches, and the best of the best of the best of the best, these professional athletes have coaches. And sometimes we preachers and pastors, we don't have a preaching coach, we don't have a diversity coach, and we're trying to think, we're thinking that we can get our skills together just by reading a couple of books. And I'm a book guy. I love books, but the idea is that a coach is able to help develop instinct and competency and confidence inside of you in areas that you would have otherwise have gained. And so that's where I would recommend to the pastor who says, look, I want to grow a cross-racial, cross-cultural church. And I will say, do you have a diversity coach? Do you have someone that comes alongside of you? Maybe listen to some sermons and
makes you aware.
Yeah. Because over the years, I've went through a battery of types of even training to say, not training, but evaluation. Am I preaching where an Asian guy gets it? Where does it land in the heart of an Asian when they hear my sermon? Where does it land in the heart of someone who's white, or someone that is a multimillionaire, or someone that who's on federal assistance? Where does my sermon land?
Once again, it's a hard thing, right? It's you're getting educated. Because that fourth characteristic that you mentioned about multicultural, diverse churches was that there's something that comes from the pastor.
Yes.
That makes the people from different cultural backgrounds feel understood, loved, affirmed, seen. Is that what, did I say that right?
Correct. They feel valued. They feel.
You think that fourth thing may be one of the most important things? I mean, you can have music that may be appealing to people that are cross-cultural, and you can have, programs to help people feel connected and belonged. Which of those?
I wouldn't rank it from that perspective, though that's an interesting one. These diverse churches, it fell in any one of those last three areas. It was either the worship, or it was either the pastor, or it was either the sense of belonging. And in some instances, they weren't there because of the pastor. They were there because of the worship. Or they weren't even there because of the worship or the pastor. They were there because of the sense of belonging. I've been in some of the racially diverse church. I remember going into Forest Hill, Georgia, to study a racially diverse church. And white pastor had no, I started asking technical questions about, what's your theology about race relations? He said, I don't have a theology. It was just naturally flowing out of his life. It was just, He didn't say, okay, here's how I stand. And he didn't deal with ethnocentrism and ethno-consciousness. He wasn't thinking about any social exchange theory. He never heard of that.
We Northeasterners tend to intellectualize everything, right?
It was just something flowing out of his life.
Yeah.
And the point I'm bringing out is that since I'm a book guy, I may have studied it and researched it and read all the stuff in the world on the topic, and that's me. But that doesn't mean that a pastor has to have that kind of background in order for God to use him that way. If it flows out of your life that you love people, they'll feel that you love them.
Okay. Let's take this one step further. One of the things that pastors are dealing with right now, and this is across the country, is the divisiveness in the culture around politics, around issues of race, around cultural issues, the new sexual mores and gender ideas have alienated people. And there are people in their churches that may not be ethnically diverse in that sense, but they're diverse in the way that they think about how these things should be resolved.
Sure.
And so one of the challenges we had in 2020 was all of those diverse issues, I think, got brought forward. The racial issue with the George Floyd protests, of course, the issue that had to do with the pandemic and did we wear masks, did we not wear masks, did we get a vaccine, did we not get a vaccine? Christians were very divided.
Yes.
And I'm certain that many churches had these issues, but churches that are diverse like ours, certainly I can speak for myself,
Yes.
It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And when you have the pandemic and then you have the racial protests, and then thirdly, within a few months, you had this presidential election that was highly divisive. And people did not see the same way on who to vote for. And people that voted for one person thought that you were a demon if you voted for the other person.
Sure.
And yet in the church, there are people that voted differently. It became a really difficult issue. And this has been addressed even recently by a great book written by Tim Alberta called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. He's an evangelical Christian that interviewed scores of pastors, Christian leaders, thought leaders all around this season and era, and really brought forth the challenges that pastors are facing. One of the things that came out clearly, 4 in 10 pastors have considered suicide in the last 3 years. 50 to 60% of pastors have considered seriously quitting, and they feel overwhelmed and exhausted, not knowing how to address those issues in their church. So maybe they had some diversity in their congregation, they were addressing things, but in that crux of challenge, all of these issues came forth, and in trying to address them, they found that they were either pleasing one group or displeasing another. And so there's a certain fatigue that even pastors today have around how do we address cultural issues. The transgender issue, which in New York has become an aggressively, an aggressive agenda in our state relative to public education. We have public school teachers in our church that are asking me, how do we address this? We want to love and accept people that have these challenges, but at the same time, we're Christians and we believe God made them male and female. Right. How do we address that? And so I want to talk about in the current cultural environment, as we move into yet another election year, and all of these issues still exist, the division in our country still exists, and the division in Christian churches and their thinking still exists. How do we approach these issues in a way that is kingdom-based, truthful, and is not unnecessarily alienating to people, especially when you've got people that think differently about the same issue?
Yeah, I recognize it's complex. I'll say that. I'll start from that premise. Also, the target keeps moving. So it's not static.
Explain that.
Yeah. One day we'll hear, there are different shades and stripes of LGBTQ world.
Right.
So one person may define it a certain way. I'm saying one adherent of that worldview may define it one way, another may define it another. So what I tend to do is to live my life in a principle-centered way. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I deal with it by looking at not one specific topic, but I deal with it by using the language, the other. The person that's different than me.
Okay.
And so be it different racially, be it different in terms of how they view gender identification, be it sexual orientation, whatever, political, whatever, I'm categorizing it as the other. How do I deal with that person?
As a Christian. What is the Christian ethic for dealing with somebody that thinks differently or is different than me?
Yeah. And so I'm looking at it that way. That person, I'm putting them in the category of the other. Then I'm going to look at it saying, there's a difference between approval and acceptance. So I keep that tension there. It has to be,
about that.
I may not be approving, or rather, I may not accept your worldview or accept your lifestyle moniker or the way you label yourself. I may not accept your sexual orientation as mine, but I will then have I think I mixed it up a little bit.
Yeah,
the language. I may not approve of it,
your
but I'm accepting you as a person.
I see.
So, in other words, I'm making space for our difference because I can't control you, nor can you control me. But I'm drawing clear line in the sand to say, this is what I approve of, and this is what I don't approve of. But I'm going to, as a human being, I'm going to provide this sense of I'm going to value you, I'm going to respect you, but I'm not going to approve of your behavior or your lifestyle or your practice or your worldview because I just don't. Because it's going to it's juxtaposed in this sense to the Christian faith, and so I'm not going to do that. And so, but it does then require.
So you're not afraid to lean in and teach the truth on issues of gender and sexual wholeness and what's right and wrong from scriptural.
But the way I lean in, I will caveat certain things. I'll say, I'm going to teach on a very sensitive topic today. And there's some people that are sitting here that are struggling with this. I don't want you to applaud if I make a strong point. I don't want you. So I'm going to put all these caveats there, because I want to be very sensitive to that person. And I'm going to have this conversation as if that person is my son or if that person is my daughter. And I'm going to teach now as if that person who's struggling with this, or maybe someone that has same-sex attraction, I'm going to describe it in a way. But I'm doing it in a way to say that if I was sitting in front of a total LGBTQ audience, whatever I say, that they'll be able to understand, here's where I'm coming from.
But you'll go ahead and preach what the Bible says about sexual sin.
Right.
What's right, what's wrong.
Right.
From a compassionate but truthful standpoint.
A compassionate, it won't be dogmatic, and I'll say
What do you mean dogmatic?
You're going to go to hell. You're doing this.
So the rhetorical style is not going to be incendiary. But it won't compromise on what's right and wrong.
I'm not going to compromise on that, but I'm going to be gentle and pastoral. I remember one church in Virginia Beach said, you got to put some pastoral glaze on things.
Yeah.
And so I have to learn sometimes when you have strong conversations or a very controversial topic, I got to put a lot of pastoral glaze on it.
One of the things I learned in my experience as a pastor with a diverse church and a voice in our community is that I have to develop different voices. So first of all, I have to know what my personal thoughts and feelings are about an issue.
Yes.
As clear as I can, personally. That's my voice to myself. And then there is the leadership voices that I have. I have to have a pastoral voice. And when I say pastoral, I'm clear about what's right and wrong in terms of God's commandments about sexuality and how he made us in gender.
Sure.
But there may be people in my church that are struggling with these issues. So I need to have a voice that addresses the people in the church that need help to get out of it, need help to understand it. So there's that pastoral voice. Then there's this practical voice, which in our churches, we've got people that are living in this culture trying to figure out how to talk to school teachers. How do I teach school when I'm being told I have to teach something that is not true?
Sure.
Yeah, how do I navigate that? What are practical skills that we as Christians can have in navigating a culture that is very, very corrupt right now? And then finally a prophetic voice, which is that voice to the community. Because what I'm going to say to my congregation is not going to be the same way that I'm going to speak maybe culturally to the community. That's how I think of it. Do you think that that's a good way to think about it? And how do pastors develop those different voices?
I think that
on these issues,
it's a great approach. I tend to believe that every time I speak, even to my congregation, I'm speaking to the broader community and global because of the internet. So I'm not just it's not as easily segmented. So I tend to deal with it saying that maybe three perspectives, for example, maybe three perspectives on this issue. This perspective will yield this kind of product. The second perspective will yield that kind of outcome. The third will yield this third outcome. Here's where I stand on the issue, and here's why I may not agree with those two other views. And so I come from it from that perspective to give. It's almost like I create this safety net to say I'm not going to be dogmatic. I'm not going to tell you that this is the only approach. But at the end of the day, you'll know where I stand. You'll know why I stand on that. And so I'm giving a person space to be able to grow and change, and for them to wrestle with it, because it's a tough issue. And that's why I use the language "the other," because there are going to be other issues that we have not thought about today that's coming.
Yeah.
It's going to be here 10 years from now or 5 years from now. And so I have to, instead of me then have to develop new language and become well-versed in that issue, if I use that language, "the other," to describe someone who's different than me, it then gives me tools in which I can interact with that person.
So let's get right down to the pastor who's got to preach. And he wants to address, or she wants to address, the sin that's in culture that is getting into the church.
Yes.
Right? They want to deal with it clearly. So it's not just a hypothetical, propositional kind of thing. This is how God commands us to live. This, wants to be very clear about right and wrong and some very important issues. how do they practically preach that in a way that is truthful, yet at the same time going to have a pastoral heart to it so that people who are dealing with those issues can get ministered to?
That's a good question. And my response is to, again, I'm going to try to remove myself personality-wise from the equation by having them wrestle with the text and inviting Jesus, so to speak, into the conversation by using either one of the parables of Jesus or just saying, what would Christ do in this situation? And so I'm going to ask those questions. I'm going to use that pregnant pause to let the question go to work in their hearts. So I think that sometimes we pastors, we tend to inject ourselves into the situation. So now they have to deal with, they're angry with us rather than being angry with the text. I want them to be angry with the text. So when they're angry with the text, then they have to wrestle with the text.
Okay. And all you're doing is presenting it.
I'm presenting it. I'm presenting it to them. Yeah.
Here's a question we're getting a lot of. These are from church members in the church. They've been invited to a gay wedding.
Yes.
Maybe of a relative or a friend. Do they go? Do they not go? If they don't go, what do they say? Do they not go to the wedding and go to the reception? How do they communicate with people when you believe that marriage is between a man and a woman and that the very institution of marriage is profaned by trying to create some other version?
And that's a very tough question. In fact, that question is creating a lot of stir within the evangelical community.
It is.
Yeah.
That's why we're going there.
And so my response is that...
And again, I don't want you to answer as if you're talking to your Sunday morning, the world, the global. I want you to think about, we're talking to evangelical pastors. They may listen, but we're not talking to them. How do we tell the pastors? How do we guide them in how to answer that question?
A question like that, I'm going to answer it a couple of ways.
Okay.
One, every situation is different. That's number one. That means every relationship that I have with a person is different. If that person who may be a member of the LGBTQ world knows that I'm not approving of their behavior, they know where I stand on the issue, they know what my views are, and they get that. And if yet I still have this deep relationship with them, let's say they're a son or a daughter or a granddaughter or a grandson, and do I go to the wedding? If they know what my views are, if they understand what my views are, and if that, will I get more traction in the long run? Because this is a long game that you're playing here. In the long game to say, that person is going to know that I'm in their life and I care for them. So I think it becomes if I choose to go to that wedding, because of that, I would only go if they already know what my position is, and I've made it very, very clear. But I'm not affirming their marriage. I'm not accepting it, and I know even my answer is controversial because some people say that's wrong. And
and if you're a pastor, and you attend a wedding that is a profane wedding like that, let's just be honest. Scripturally, it's profane.
Well, no, I'm not. I'm not going to be the one marrying them.
No. But let's be honest about it. You're attending. In some ways, as a pastor, what you go to, you're perceived as
affirming.
Endorsing, even if you're not endorsing everything that's happening. So,
and that's why I'm saying that it depends on the relationship, the level of the relationship. So that's why I'm going to do a case-by-case basis, because I wouldn't make a blanket statement. I think that if there's a way, I'm going to do my best not to go. But if there's a person that, let's say, for example, they're the only grandchild, and I've been dealing with that grandchild for years and helping them. And so there's a layer of complication.
In other words, maybe not going is going to cause a deep wound that's going to not help them.
A deep wound that's irreversible in the sense that you've not been there for me, so you lost the right to confront me. You lose the right to minister to me. You lose the right to be in my life. You lose the right for me to have a conversation with you in an ongoing way. So that's what I'm going to look at. So I'm looking at the long game, so to speak. And so that's why I say it's a case-by-case basis. But I have to have laid out, first of all, I'm not approving.
So just a little further in this.
Yes.
So if someone approaches a church member and says, or they get an invitation to a wedding, they don't approve of that institution, that wedding happening because it's not a scriptural wedding. Wouldn't you think that a person would need to go to that individual and say, listen, I just want, because they may not know where you stand. In some cases, they don't know. So, and to say to them, listen, I care about you, I love you, but I want you to know that I don't believe in this.
Right.
And so if you have me come, you need to know that I'm there, not believing that this is legit.
And that's what I mean by you've already made clear that you're not approving. Now, I'll give you a slightly different scenario. I remember this couple in my congregation, they left a church because the pastor of that church that they left said to them, you need to have no more relationship with your LGBTQ son.
Wow.
So it was very stark. It's cutting
them off.
Cut them off. I didn't take such an abrupt position. I took the position, this is your son. You're not approving of his behavior, but this is still your son. So now where the tension of the text is that, not only are children to honor their mother and father, but there's an honoring that also must be incumbent upon the parent towards the child, not saying that you believe in that.
Right.
And there are a lot of things that children do that parents don't believe in, even if it's not deal with gender or sexuality. It may be their lifestyle of criminal behavior or whatever it may be. It may not have anything to do those things.
These are the questions that people are facing, pastors are facing, and we could go on with this all day because there's so many different, as you said, and I think you said it beautifully, every situation's different and unique, and you have to kind of discern it in that way. But I think you have to know in yourself what you believe, and then as a pastor, lead in a way that's clear and at the same time compassionate. And that's, I think, where pastors, the questions that we're getting from pastors, the questions I'm hearing is they're telling me situations in their churches where they've got parents who have a child that is, they've been raised in the church, they love Jesus, and the child is now, because it's been introduced to them through social media, wants to explore their gender.
Right.
A girl that wants to explore being a boy, she's 12, 13, 14, sometimes younger. And those parents can't affirm that because scripturally we know that that's not how God created us.
Sure.
So, but they need the practical pastoral counsel. How do we help pastors help families like that?
And I think that this is going to be a conversation we've been having for decades to come because it's not going away and it's a reality. Paul's had experiences like that in his day. It may not have been as pronounced or as stark or as quote unquote legalized in many areas.
Just give us, give our listeners some, just something to hang their hats on when they're dealing with this. When these things come up, what are some core things they can keep in mind when addressing them as pastors?
One, make a clear commitment that you're loving the person and your love is firm. Period. Second, that you are non-affirming of their choice, but your love for them has not changed. Clear.
So you affirm them as a person.
Them as a human being, but you're not affirming their lifestyle choice or the definition that they impose on themselves. Third, you ask them would you be willing to be open? Because as life progresses, you may find yourself changing the way you feel about yourself, the way you think, the labels that you apply on yourself today. You may find yourself going through changes because all of us are changing as human beings to become more whole. We become more understanding of ourselves. So don't do something that's not reversible. And and there's sometimes people who've done that in terms of how they've modified their bodies, and then 2-3 years later they regret it because they were going through a phase or they were listening to someone that was influencing them adversely.
Do you think that pastors should teach messages and series specifically about gender to bring clarity to people?
That's one of the topics for this year for us. It's a 4-week series. And we're also hosting a seminar on it by bringing in outside individuals who've come out of that lifestyle, who can speak to it as someone who's lived it.
That's fantastic.
So I think that's we're still trying to lock in the dates. We're trying to do it in the fall. It's going to be in November or sometimes what we're aiming for. And so I think that was the way we're approaching it, because I think that I can't speak to it from a first-hand perspective. I can only speak to it from a pastor, from a theological, having researched it, read tons of books on it. But there's a whole different experience when a person says, I've lived this way for 10 years or 12 years, and let me tell you, and I'm no longer that way, and now let me tell you why I'm no longer in the LGBTQ world and how I see myself.
And those stories need to be told.
Correct. And that's what I think that power is going to be very transformative. It's not the only thing. You still, as a pastor, have to address the issue and show the congregation what the Scripture speaks, what the Scripture says. But I think expose them to individuals like that will be very important.
Excellent. One last question. As we approach the fall and what promises to be a dynamic political season, pastors and churches are acknowledging that they're facing realities with their congregants who think differently about how to resolve political tensions. They have different politics as it relates to things. They love Jesus. They don't think the same on everything. How would you advise pastors to address people who have different views as it relates to political issues in a political season in the culture we live in?
I think that it's not my role to be able to sway people to one political view, Democrats, Republicans. And so I never stand up and make a divisive statement from a political perspective. I don't. And I tell
if you have church members that say, if you don't endorse this candidate, you're weak.
Then I'll tell them that being weak is underrated. So what's wrong with being weak then? So I'm not going to be manipulated into doing that. I'll let them know that I have a pastoral responsibility to pastor Democrats, Republicans, and every.
You have to have a voice to everybody.
Yeah, correct. And that's how I'm going to present myself. And I'll let them know that if you try to manipulate me to be able to endorse something, then you're being divisive because you've not understood intellectual honesty and what it means to create a safe environment. And so I'm going to confront them from that perspective, but not to say you need to switch being this or that. Right. And I may even throw out the joke where the politician, somebody said, what's your position on the issue? He said, well, some of my friends are for the issue. Some of my friends are against the issue. I'm for my friends.
Yes.
So sometimes I jokingly say, I'm for my friends.
This is excellent. Dr. Ireland, this has been great. Thank you. I've learned a lot. In fact, listening to you today, I just realized I feel convicted about some of the ways I've approached things in the past. In my passion to get people to see something that I've been awakened to, sometimes I haven't used the best tools. And this has been very helpful. I just want to sit in a class and let you talk to me. And the reason I'm throwing these hard questions at you is because these are my personal questions too. Okay. Because that's what I'm dealing with. It's what we're hearing others deal with. And this has been fantastic.
And the pleasure.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure. And the pleasure is mine for me to come and to speak to shepherds. Thank you so much. And it's a great podcast. And thank you for serving the shepherds and meeting our needs.
Absolutely. Pastor David, if someone that's listening or watching wants to get more help or wants more resources, you've written some phenomenal books. I don't know if you have a ministerial network or fellowship. What are some ways that if they wanted to know more about you and your ministry, they could connect with you or your work?
If you go to davidireland.org, and Ireland is spelled like country, and so davidireland.org, the name of my church is Christ Church. And so if you go to christchurchusa.org, you'll get that information. Any of my books, I've written over 30 books, and so you can go to Amazon, and then you can just type my name in, and boom, up comes the books. And so what
was your last book?
My last book was called One in Christ.
And so what was it about?
It was about diversity. What does it mean to build a cross-cultural, multiracial lifestyle?
So a lot of the things that we've been talking about are in that book, right?
Actually, some of the new stuff hasn't even been in that book. There's new stuff.
Did we get some of the new stuff here today?
I got some new stuff. I'm working on a new book called Included. And so that's going to be some of the new stuff about desired awareness. And
Thank you. Thank you for your ministry. Yeah. Thank you for being a voice of clarity in a difficult and challenging generation.
It's my pleasure.
It's Jesus. And thank you for being a light.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us on the Shepherds Podcast. Once again, if you like this, like it. If this is blessing you and you'd like other pastors or ministry leaders, maybe people that work in your church to hear this, share it with them. And we'd love to have you comment and let us know how this is hitting you. If there's things we've said that you might not agree with or you might think differently or have further questions about, please let us know because we're going to read that and that's going to help us become better at answering questions. We're not going to see eye to eye on everything, I'm certain, but we can grow together as we have real, sometimes challenging conversations about the things we face as shepherds in these days. Once again, God bless you. And until we talk to you next time, may God abundantly bless everything in your life in Jesus' name.
Thanks for joining us on the Shepherds Podcast. For more episodes and resources, you can check out our YouTube page or our website at theshepherdsnetwork.com.